The room was packed, cameras clicked, murmurs rippled through the press corps like an electric current, a mix of anticipation and quiet hostility. Clint Eastwood stepped onto the podium, his movements measured, controlled. The press room was packed, buzzing with quiet murmurs as reporters braced themselves, laptops open, cameras rolling. The air felt charged, not just with anticipation but with something sharper. He adjusted the microphone, eyes scanning the room. He already knew how this would go. This wasn't just a briefing, it was a setup. A political chess match where the media held their pre-written narratives like loaded weapons, ready to fire. He gave them a polite smile, but there was steel behind it. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the subscribe button to stay updated with more content like this. Good afternoon, everyone, he began, his voice clear and steady. I know you've all been eager for this briefing, so let's get right to it. A pause, a calculated beat of silence. Before we begin, let's establish something, he continued, his tone sharp but controlled. If the media is going to set the rules of outrage, they should at least be consistent about it. A few reporters shifted in their seats, sensing where this was going. Clint placed his hands on the podium, locking eyes with the front row. If a Republican stood here today and said we need to fight in the streets, you'd all be foaming at the mouth, demanding resignations, congressional investigations, maybe even arrests. But when Ilhan Omar says it, suddenly it's just a passionate plea for justice. The room tensed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The reporters had come prepared to attack him, but Clint had just set the terms of engagement. A hand shot up. Peter from CNN, predictable. He cleared his throat, voice laced with carefully measured skepticism. Clint, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence? Clint tilted his head slightly, as if Peter had just asked him if water was wet. I'm not suggesting anything, Peter. I'm quoting her. Or do you deny she said it? Peter hesitated. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker of uncertainty in his face. Clint leaned forward slightly, pressing in. Let's be clear, he continued. When Democrats call for fighting in the streets, it's dismissed as rhetoric. But when a Republican so much as breathes the wrong way, it's a threat to democracy. So tell me, Peter, what's the rule here? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the rules only apply to one side. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. No response. Another reporter, a woman from NBC, jumped in, trying to shift the angle. Surely you're not suggesting that the president is above criticism? Ilhan Omar was simply expressing concerns about this administration's policies. Clint turned to her, unimpressed. So was every conservative who got labeled a domestic extremist for daring to question the Biden administration. Funny how that works. Silence. A few furrowed brows, some shuffled notes, hoping to find an angle to trap him, but he wasn't done yet. He glanced at the cameras. This moment wasn't just for the reporters, it was for every American watching at home. Let's play a game, he said, his voice calm, measured. Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, we need to take this fight to the streets. What would happen? Nobody answered. The silence stretched just long enough before he filled it himself. There'd be front-page hysteria, emergency broadcasts, calls for impeachment. The media would be in full meltdown mode. But Ilhan Omar says it. Nothing. Just another Tuesday. More silence. The energy in the room shifted. The press had come here to corner him, but now they were the ones on the defensive. Then a voice broke through. Clint. It was James from NBC, a veteran journalist, his tone measured. Are you saying that outrage over political rhetoric is selective? Clint turned to him, raising an eyebrow. I don't need to say it, James. You all prove it every single day. More murmurs. Someone whispered to a colleague. Another reporter hastily typed notes, fingers tapping against the keyboard. Then Peter from CNN tried again, this time sharper, more aggressive. But Clint, don't you think context matters? Ilhan Omar was referring to, oh, I love that word, context. Clint tilted his head. Because when President Trump said peacefully and patriotically, make your voices heard, you all conveniently ignored the context. In fact, you used it to try to throw him in jail. A ripple went through the press corps. Someone coughed. Another reporter muttered something under their breath. Peter clenched his jaw, but before he could formulate a response, Clint held up a hand. You want to talk about context, Peter? Let's talk about it. Ilhan Omar didn't say peacefully and patriotically. She said we have to fight in the streets. So I'll ask again, why is it different? Silence. No one wanted to answer that question. Then, as if on cue, a phone buzzed from the front row. A reporter glanced at the screen, eyes widening, before looking up. Clint noticed. What is it? He asked casually. The reporter hesitated. Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you. Clint let out a quiet chuckle. Of course she did. He turned back to the room, expression unbothered. Let me guess. She's calling me dangerous? Maybe even a racist. Classic. He reached for the iPad on the podium, pulling up the live tweet. Then in a clear, deliberate voice, he read it aloud. Clint Eastwood is spreading dangerous rhetoric to distract from Trump's reckless agenda. He looked back at the room, eyes scanning the reporters. That's cute. But here's the thing. Her words are on video, plain as day, and she doesn't get to decide what's dangerous and what's not. The press corps sat in silence. They knew he had a point. They just didn't know how to admit it. Clint took a breath, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. This wasn't over, not even close. He straightened, eyes sharp. Next question. The room was still, but the tension was suffocating. The press had walked in expecting to control the narrative, yet here they were, cornered. Clint tapped his fingers lightly against the podium, waiting. He knew someone would try to shift the conversation to regain control. James from the Washington Post was the first to take the bait. Clint, he started, measured but firm. You're quoting Ilhan Omar's words, but are you really suggesting she meant it as a call for violence? Clint tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. James, am I supposed to believe she meant it as a poetry reading? A few low chuckles rippled through the room. James cleared his throat, pressing forward. But rhetoric is open to interpretation. You're treating her words as dangerous? But what about Trump's past statements? Don't you think some of them could also be seen as incendiary? Clint gave him a slow nod, as if he had just walked into his trap. Oh, I see what you're doing, he said. So now intent matters. That's interesting. He let that hang in the air for a second before continuing. Because when Trump said peacefully and patriotically, make your voices heard, the media spent years claiming it was a call to violence. James shifted slightly. He didn't like where this was going. But when Ilhan Omar literally says, we have to fight in the streets, suddenly we need context. Silence. Clint nodded, his tone steady but sharp. This isn't about heated rhetoric, James. This is about who is allowed to use it. A few reporters glanced at each other, some typing frantically, others waiting for a counterattack. Peter from CNN took the shot. Clint, you say there's a double standard, but let's be honest. Trump's rhetoric has led to real-world violence. Can you honestly compare that to Ilhan Omar's words? Clint let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, Peter, he sighed. You people never disappoint. He reached for his iPad, swiping quickly before turning the screen toward the cameras. This is Bernard Felix, he said, just arrested for attacking a Republican volunteer, shouted that they deserve to die. He swiped again. This man firebombed a GOP office, told police he was following orders. Another swipe. And this, he paused, letting the silence build. This is the man who shot a Republican congressman on a baseball field. No one spoke. Clint set the iPad down, folding his arms. So tell me, Peter, he said, his voice smooth but cutting, do these count as real-world consequences? Or does political violence only matter when it fits your narrative? A visible shift in the room. Reporters looked uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact. Then from the back, a younger MSNBC journalist forced a question out. But Clint, he said cautiously, you're cherry-picking cases to make a broader claim. Isn't it dangerous to suggest that one side is responsible for all political violence? Clint turned to him, eyes narrowing slightly. Ah, so now we care about nuance? The reporter stiffened. Clint continued, voice firm. I find it funny how Trump supporters get blamed for everything from election protests to a hoax noose in NASCAR, But when a Democrat literally says, we need to fight in the streets, suddenly we need to look at the bigger picture. He let the question linger in the air. Nobody answered. He exhaled slightly, checking his watch. We're barely 20 minutes in, and you've already proved my point. He tapped the podium once, looking back up. The truth is, this was never about fighting rhetoric. It was always about controlling who was allowed to speak. Still no response. He straightened, ready for the next battle. Next question. The tension in the press room was thick. Reporters shuffled their notes, recalibrating. The narrative wasn't going how they had planned. Clint Eastwood had just dismantled their selective outrage over political rhetoric. But they weren't done. They had another card to play, Elon Musk. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, pen tapping against his notepad. Clint, he started carefully, measured. Let's talk about Elon Musk's new role. The president's decision to appoint him as head of the Department of Government Efficiency? Isn't that just a way to reward a billionaire ally? A few reporters nodded, sensing a possible weak point. Clint almost laughed. Here we go. Oh, so now you all care about billionaires influencing government. He folded his arms. That's funny, because I don't remember any of you complaining when Mark Zuckerberg was spending $400 million to influence elections. Silence, he pressed on. Or when Jeff Bezos was receiving billions in government contracts while owning a newspaper that conveniently never criticizes the left. Peter from CNN interjected quickly, trying to regain control. But Clint, Musk isn't just any billionaire. He's been openly aligned with Trump's policies. Isn't this appointment just a case of political favoritism? Clint didn't even blink. You mean the same way Hunter Biden received cushy foreign business deals while his father was vice president? Or the way Nancy Pelosi's husband magically made all the right stock trades before major legislative decisions? The room stiffened. Funny how political favoritism only seems to be an issue when it involves someone the media doesn't like. James adjusted his tie, pushing forward. But Clint, let's talk about oversight. Elon Musk now has access to government systems, specifically in the Treasury and DOJ. Shouldn't the American people be concerned about a private businessman having influence over public finances? Clint leaned in slightly, voice firm. Let's get our facts straight, James. The DOJ engineers Musk is working with only have read-only access to Treasury systems. They cannot write new code. A few reporters exchanged glances. They knew he was right. He continued. And let's be honest, what really bothers you isn't Musk having oversight. It's that he's actually going to expose how much taxpayer money has been wasted. The room fell silent for a second. Then from the back, a young journalist from NBC raised her voice. But Clint, Musk's companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, have received billions in government subsidies. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? Clint tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. That's interesting, because the Biden administration literally appointed former Google and Facebook executives to government roles overseeing tech regulations. A few cameras zoomed in, catching the growing unease in the room. But somehow that's not a conflict of interest? More silence. Clint scanned the room, sensing that the energy had shifted. They weren't getting the attack angle they wanted. He decided to drive it home. This administration was elected to drain the swamp, to cut waste, and to make government run like a business, not like some slush fund for career politicians. He let the words settle. Now I get it. The media doesn't like that because if the government actually became efficient, what would the Democratic Party campaign on? A few suppressed chuckles, a few glares. Clint checked the time. All right, he said, knowing they weren't done yet. Next question. The press had failed to corner Clint on Elon Musk, but they had another attack ready. Peter from CNN jumped in. Clint, NBC reports that some illegal immigrants arrested under Trump's policies aren't being deported. Instead, they're being released with ankle monitors or phone check-ins. Isn't that a failure? Clint barely held back a smirk. He had seen this coming. I'm glad you asked, Peter, he said. Let's talk numbers. He glanced at the cameras. As of this morning, over 8,000 illegal immigrants have been arrested under President Trump's policies, he stated, and out of those, only 461 have been released. That's less than 6%. Silence. But the media spins it as if mass releases are happening. James from the Washington Post pushed back. But Clint, doesn't this prove Trump's policies aren't working? Why is anyone being released at all? Clint didn't blink. Some were released due to medical conditions, others because detention space is limited. He tilted his head. And who's blocking funding for more detention centers? He let the question hang. The reporters knew exactly who was responsible. A young MSNBC journalist jumped in. But Clint, many of these individuals haven't committed crimes. Are you treating all undocumented immigrants as criminals? Clint laughed lightly. Oh, so now you care about the difference? He scanned the room. I remember when you all called Trump racist for deporting gang members. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably. But let's be clear, he continued. Entering this country illegally is already breaking the law. Peter from CNN tried again. Are you saying the administration has no responsibility for these releases? Clint locked eyes with him. We are deporting as many as possible. But when Congress blocks resources, they can't turn around and blame us. Silence. He checked the time. Well, he said, his tone light but firm. Next question. The media had failed to pin Clint on immigration, but they weren't done yet. James from the Washington Post leaned in, flipping through his notes. Clint, the president has made it clear that Palestinians have no choice but to leave Gaza. But they say this is their home. How does the administration justify this? Clint remained composed, his eyes scanning the room. The president's goal is simple, he said. Rebuild Gaza, ensure peace, prevent another war. A slight pause. But let's be honest, he continued. The media keeps asking what Trump is doing, but never asked why Gaza is in ruins in the first place. A few reporters stiffened. Why is Gaza unlivable today, he asked, letting the silence stretch. Because Hamas, a terrorist group backed by Iran, launched a brutal attack on Israel. They slaughtered civilians, took hostages, and used Palestinians as human shields. Peter from CNN jumped in. But Clint, are you saying Trump bears no responsibility for this crisis? Clint let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. I'm saying Hamas started this war, he stated. But instead of demanding that Hamas surrenders, the media is demanding Trump explain his response. He let that sink in. A young MSNBC reporter pushed forward. But Clint, Palestinians say they don't want to leave Gaza. Is the U.S. prepared to force them out? Clint met her gaze. No, he said firmly. The U.S. is not forcing anyone out. We are prepared to help rebuild, but we will not allow another Hamas-controlled war zone to emerge. James from the Washington Post pounced. The president said he's willing to use the military if necessary. Does that mean U.S. troops will be deployed? Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. The president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground, he clarified, but he's keeping all options open because when it comes to national security, he won't play political games. Some reporters looked dissatisfied. They wanted a reckless statement. He didn't give them one. He let a moment pass. The real question is, he said, scanning the room, why aren't you asking Hamas to surrender? Silence. A flicker of discomfort crossed James's face. Another journalist from NPR tried to redirect. But Clint, there are concerns that Trump's stance on Gaza will escalate tensions with key allies. What is the administration doing to prevent further instability? Clint exhaled slightly, as if he had been waiting for this question all along. The president has already spoken with Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, he revealed. We're coordinating with our allies to ensure that the region stabilizes. He folded his hands. But the media keeps pretending that Trump is making rash, unilateral decisions. A few reporters looked down at their notes. Others typed away, already spinning their stories. Clint checked the time. Well, he said with a knowing smile. Next question. The media had failed to trap Clint on Gaza, but they weren't done yet. If they couldn't win with facts, they'd try something else. Misrepresentation. Peter from CNN adjusted his mic, ready to strike. Clint, CNN is reporting that you suggested illegal immigrants aren't deserving of humane treatment. Do you stand by that? Clint's brow lifted slightly. He knew where this was going. Peter, he said calmly, would you mind reading exactly what I said? Peter hesitated. He glanced at his notes, then back at him. Well, in context, No, no. Clint cut him off smoothly. I asked for exactly what I said, not your interpretation. Silence. Peter cleared his throat. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, he admitted. Clint smirked. Of course you don't. He tapped on his iPad, pulling up the transcript himself. Allow me to help, he said, turning the screen toward the cameras. He read aloud. I said illegal immigration is a national security crisis, and the Biden administration's policies have made it worse. He looked up at Peter. Where exactly did I say anything about immigrants not deserving humane treatment? Peter's jaw tightened. Well, the implication was... Clint held up a hand. No, Peter. CNN didn't report what I said. You twisted it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press room. He wasn't done yet. This is exactly what the media does, he continued. You don't like what I actually said, so you invent a version that fits your narrative. James from the Washington Post tried to jump in. Clint, even if the wording was misinterpreted, don't you think... Clint cut him off, flipping the screen to a new tab. Let's talk about misinterpretation, James. He tapped on an article headline from MSNBC. It read, Clint Eastwood refuses to deny Trump will use U.S. troops to remove Palestinians. Clint looked around the room. Raise your hand if you were here when I answered that question. A few journalists hesitated before slowly raising their hands. Clint leaned forward. Did I say that Trump would use the military to remove Palestinians? Silence. Anyone, he pressed. More silence. He tilted his head. Because what I actually said was, and I quote, the president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground, but is keeping all options open to maintain stability. He let the words sink in. But MSNBC decided to rewrite reality, and now Twitter is filled with people believing a completely false headline. A young MSNBC reporter shifted in his seat. Clint, that headline is just an interpretation of... Clint laughed lightly, shaking his head. Interpretation, he repeated. No, that's called a lie. He scanned the room. This is how it worked, he said. The media creates a false story, spreads it across every platform, and hopes people never fact-check it. He glanced at the cameras. And if you don't believe me, just wait until tonight's news coverage. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Others were already rewriting their narratives. Clint checked the time. Well, he said with a knowing smile. Next question. The press had been caught red-handed twisting Clint's words, but they weren't giving up. When they couldn't trap him, they pivoted to Trump. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, his voice careful but pointed. Clint, you've spent a lot of time criticizing the media's handling of rhetoric, he began, but let's talk about the president's own words. Clint tilted his head slightly. Here it came. James continued, flipping through his notes. The president has a history of strong language, many would say inflammatory language. He's called political opponents enemies, he said. We need to fight back hard. Given today's climate, don't you think his rhetoric contributes to division? Clint let out a slow breath, then met his gaze. You mean the same way Ilhan Omar told her supporters to fight in the streets? James hesitated. Or the way Chuck Schumer threatened Supreme Court justices, saying they would pay the price. James opened his mouth, then closed it. Clint folded his hands. This is what the press does, he said. When Democrats use aggressive rhetoric, you call it passionate advocacy. But when Trump says something strong, you call it incitement. Silence. Peter from CNN jumped in, trying to regain control. But Clint, the difference is, Trump is the former president and current leader of the GOP. His words carry weight. Don't you think he has a responsibility to be more careful? Clint leaned forward slightly, voice steady. Did you ask Joe Biden that? He challenged. Peter blinked. When Biden called Trump's supporters semi-fascists, where was your concern about division? When Hillary Clinton said Republicans were part of a basket of deplorables, did you ask if she was responsible for political violence? Peter stiffened, but Clint wasn't done. Because when a far-left activist shot up a Republican baseball practice, nobody blamed Democratic rhetoric. When a man attacked Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's home, nobody asked if Chuck Schumer's words contributed to that. He let the words hang for a second. But when Trump says, fight back, Suddenly, the media acts like he's calling for civil war. The press room fell silent. A younger journalist from MSNBC spoke up hesitantly. But Clint, Trump has been accused of encouraging January 6th. Shouldn't he acknowledge the impact his words had? Clint laughed lightly, shaking his head. Oh, I love this game, he said, because when Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, you twisted it into a call for violence. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the reporters. But when Biden said in Philadelphia that Trump's supporters are a threat to democracy, while standing in front of a blood-red backdrop, you didn't call it dangerous. You applauded it. A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Clint scanned the room, eyes sharp. You don't actually care about rhetoric, he said. You care about who's saying it. Peter shifted in his seat. But Clint, if Trump runs again, shouldn't he be more careful with his words? Clint let out a slow exhale. The media has spent years demanding that Trump change his tone. He paused for emphasis. But has the media ever changed its tone about Trump? Did you ever stop calling him a threat to democracy? Did you stop comparing him to a dictator? Did you ever acknowledge that his supporters are millions of everyday Americans, not some extremist fringe? He scanned the room. Of course not, because the media's job isn't to demand civility. It's to demand submission. No one spoke. Clint checked the time, then looked back up. Well, he said with a knowing smirk. Next question. The press had tried everything, from twisting Clint's words to blaming Trump for division, but nothing had worked. Now they had a new strategy. They weren't going to attack Clint themselves. They were going to let Ilhan Omar do it for them. Midway through the briefing, a reporter in the back suddenly looked up from his phone, eyes wide. A few others whispered among themselves, glancing at their screens. Clint noticed immediately. What is it? He asked, arms crossed. A journalist from MSNBC cleared his throat. Well, Clint, he said carefully, Ilhan Omar is live on Morning Joe right now, and she's talking about you. A murmur spread through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Clint smirked. Oh, he said, tapping his earpiece. Well, let's hear it then. A producer rushed forward, holding up an iPad with the live MSNBC broadcast on screen. Ilhan Omar sat across from Joe Scarborough, her expression tight with frustration. This administration is dangerous, Omar declared. Clint Eastwood is spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures. And let's be clear, he is deliberately putting people's lives at risk. Clint raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Omar continued, her voice rising. The way he dismissed concerns over Trump's rhetoric, it's reckless. It's a direct threat to democracy. And let's not forget, he's using the same dog whistles that the far right has used for decades. The MSNBC host nodded in agreement, then added, Clint even questioned your comments about fighting in the streets. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Omar didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly. I was speaking metaphorically. I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights. But Clint is twisting my words because he's desperate to distract from what's really happening. The clip ended. The press room sat in silence, waiting for Clint's response. He took his time, letting the weight of it settle. Then finally he sighed softly, shaking his head. That's cute, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. But here's the problem. He gestured toward the reporters. You all just heard what Ilhan Omar said on live TV, that she was speaking metaphorically, that she wasn't actually calling for violence. A pause. Now let's rewind. He tapped his iPad, pulling up the exact quote from Omar's speech. He read it aloud. We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets. He looked back at the room. Tell me, he said, voice sharp, what part of that sounds metaphorical? Silence. He let the quiet stretch, then continued. This is what they do, he said. They say something extreme. Then when they get called out, they claim they were misinterpreted. He tapped his mic lightly, his voice dripping with amusement. So let's get this straight. When Ilhan Omar says fight in the streets, we're supposed to assume she means protest. She tilted his head slightly. But when Trump says fight like hell, we're supposed to assume he means a coup. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Clint leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. It's not about what's being said, he said. It's about who is saying it. He let that sink in. Another reporter, trying to salvage the moment, spoke up. But Clint, aren't you just doing the same thing? Taking Ilhan Omar's words out of context? Clint sighed dramatically, shaking his head. See, that's the difference, he said. I didn't invent what she said. I didn't twist her words. I played the clip exactly as it happened. He tapped his iPad again, flipping it toward the cameras. I'm not the one spinning a narrative, he said. She is. Silence. The press had nothing to say. Clint checked the time. Well, he said with a knowing smile. Next question. The press had tried everything, twisting Clint's words, blaming Trump, and now letting Ilhan Omar attack him live on air. But none of it had worked. Omar had walked straight into Clint's trap, and now the media needed a way out. James from the Washington Post was the first to attempt an escape. Clint, let's move on, he said, flipping his notepad. The president recently made some strong remarks about the economy. Can you clarify? Clint held up a hand, stopping him cold. Oh no, he said, shaking his head. We're not moving on just yet. James hesitated. The tension snapped back into the room. You all just spent the last 20 minutes framing me as the problem, Clint continued. Let's not suddenly pretend like this Ilhan Omar situation never happened. Silence. Clint glanced at the cameras. America deserves to see this, he said. This is how the media works. A few journalists shifted uncomfortably. Peter from CNN jumped in, voice tight. But Clint, we've already addressed Omar's comments. We've given you a chance to respond. No, Peter, she cut him off. You gave Ilhan Omar a chance to rewrite her own words. He folded his arms. I'm just wondering when the media is finally going to hold her accountable the way you hold Trump accountable. Peter's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting we haven't covered Omar fairly? Clint tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Well, let's test that, he said. She pulled up a set of headlines on his iPad and turned the screen toward the cameras. Here's how you covered Trump, he said, reading them aloud. Trump's violent rhetoric inspires insurrection. CNN. Trump's words are a threat to democracy. Washington Post. Trump's dangerous speech sparks extremism. MSNBC. He swiped again, revealing a new set of headlines. And here's how you covered Omar. Ilhan Omar calls for action on civil rights. CNN. Omar's passionate speech highlights political divide. NBC. Ilhan Omar urges Americans to fight for justice. MSNBC. He looked up. Spot the difference? Silence. The reporters knew they had no answer. Clint tapped the iPad lightly, his voice calm but cutting. This is the double standard Americans are tired of. He let the words sink in. James tried again, desperate to change the subject. Well, Clint, as I was saying, the president's economic policies... Clint shook his head. Oh, so now we want to talk about the economy? He asked. Now that the Ilhan Omar scandal is blowing up on Twitter, you all suddenly want to pivot. A few reporters glanced at their phones, seeing the backlash unfold in real time. Clint sighed, looking directly at the press corps. You can try to change the subject all you want, he said, but Americans see what's happening here. He set his iPad down, crossing his arms. This isn't about what's right. It's not about truth. It's about who gets protected and who gets destroyed. Silence. Clint checked the time. Well, he said, a small smirk forming. Next question. The press had tried everything. Twisting Clint's words, blaming Trump, letting Ilhan Omar rewrite reality, and now desperately trying to pivot away from their own hypocrisy. But Clint wasn't letting them off that easy. Peter from CNN, clearly agitated, adjusted his tie and leaned in. Well, Clint, he said, forcing composure, we've covered a lot today, but let's end on this. What do you say to those who believe the Trump administration is fostering division in this country? Clint let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I say that's the biggest lie the media has ever sold the American people. Silence. He placed his hands on the podium, his gaze locking onto the cameras. You call Trump divisive, he said, but who spent the last 8 years telling half the country their values are outdated? That their faith is a threat to democracy? That their race makes them inherently problematic? Some reporters glanced at each other, unsure if they should push back. Clint continued, the media doesn't fear Trump. They fear what he represents. He leaned in slightly. Because he proved something that terrifies them. They don't control the people anymore. A few reporters looked uncomfortable. Some furiously typed away, crafting a new angle. Clint let the silence settle, then smiled slightly. So now the question is, he said, looking directly at the press corps, what happens next? He let the words linger. The room stayed silent, waiting for him to say more. He didn't. Clint checked the time, straightened his papers, and stepped back from the podium. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam the media. He simply turned and walked away. Reporters shouted after him. Cameras flashed, but Clint never looked back. And just like that, the briefing was over. But the real battle, it was just beginning. The press corps sat stunned, their narratives shattered, their tactics exposed. They had come prepared to corner Clint Eastwood, to force him into defensive positions, to extract sound bites they could weaponize. Instead, he had methodically dismantled their double standards, exposed their partisan coverage, and revealed the hypocrisy that had become their trademark. Outside the press room, phones were already buzzing with notifications. Social media was ablaze with clips from the briefing, ordinary Americans sharing the moment a Trump press secretary had finally fought back against a media machine that had long abandoned objectivity. The headlines would come soon, twisted, sanitized versions of what had truly transpired. But it wouldn't matter. The American people had seen the raw footage. They had witnessed the truth. As Clint walked down the corridor toward his office, aides handed him briefing notes for his next meeting. The battle with the press corps was over for today, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attacks, new attempts to undermine the administration. He wasn't naive. He knew the media would regroup, craft new narratives, and return the next day with fresh ammunition. But for the first time in years, the rules of engagement had changed. The press no longer controlled the narrative unchallenged. The American people were watching, and they could see through the charade. Clint Eastwood stepped into his office and closed the door. The real work was just beginning.